Okay. Uh, Thanks for the invitation and for the class. Okay. So one line of research, how are you students? Which one? One line of research in my lab focuses on how people, especially the human brain, anticipate actions and intentions of others with value-based goals to produce decisions within personal interactions. Specifically, we reverse engineering the process. Like in industry, people will decompose a product into pieces to figure out how the product is made. So in our research, we ask people to make decisions in the lab control setting, and then use computational models to decompose the decision-making process, and then use the brain to tell whether and how each computational component works during the decision-making process. And hopefully in this way, we'll figure out, or we'll get closer to the true data generating process underlying social inferences. And so the central role in this process would be the computational models, which we use, for example, the reinforcement learning, which Charlie and we talked a lot about yesterday, and also game theory. Okay, so one thing very interesting, because I was from a behavioral game theory background. I got my PhD in economics. So I was trained as a game theorist before I entered this field. So one interesting observation is that in game theory, the traditional game theory, usually people starting one-shot interaction, and like prisoner dilemma, for example, and then figure out like equilibrium, like Nash equilibrium, and then move on to more complex settings like repeated interactions. However, in neuroscience, and as well as in AI nowadays, people usually start with repeated interactions to study how we form these inferences through statistical learning by learning about the statistical regularities in the previous interactions. And then later, more and more, we probably will move on to how people will use those experiences and generate to novel social interactions to enable us to make rational decisions in one-shot interaction. So for today's talk, I'll very quickly talk over 3 projects. One, the first 2 belongs to this inferences during or using statistical learning or social learning. One is about dyadic strategic interaction. The other is about learning on social networks. And then I'll very quickly talk about the one-shot coordination, where people use this knowledge alignment to provide a computational shortcut for that. Okay, so a little bit background about decision neuroscience. So the field actually starts probably the late 90s and early 2000s, at a time when neuroscientists teamed with theoretical neuroscientists and physicists to find that the dopamine has this close connection with reinforcement learning. I probably don't need to go through all these details. Basically, it finds that dopamine doesn't signal how happy you are, but rather it signals a surprise. For example, when the monkey learned that a certain stimulus, for example, a sound, will predict the reward, then when the monkey receives the reward as expected, we don't see this dopamine signal, but rather we see this dopamine signal firing at a time when we see the stimulus, when we know that they're going to be reward ahead of the later on. And when the stimulus is on, but later we don't see the reward as expected, we actually see this decrease of dopamine signal. And all this can be explained very nicely by a really simple TD reinforcement learning model. And why this is important? Because now using this model, we can actually compute like very precisely how does our brain form expectations about future reward, the reward expectation, and how can we update this reward signal through environmental feedbacks. And that allows us to go beyond the traditional stimulus reward association and now really think about like the underlying cognitive states such as reward expectation or prediction error. For example, when we need to make a decision between, let's say, water and coffee in front of the vending machine, our brain is not actually computing the reward I am experiencing, but rather computing this expected reward that I'll receive from the water and from the coffee. So those are super important. The ability for us to compute this expectation is super important for us to really understand the decision-making process. And using these frameworks over the past 20 years, there has been tons of research in figuring out like how the human brain using reward expectations to not only in the non-social situation, but also to guide our decisions in social interactions, for example, forming trust. And sorry for the Chinese on this side, basically says that it can be used to study how our brain handle risk, handle exploration, exploitation, cognitive control, social reward, etc., etc. However, the traditional simple or model-free reinforcement learning could be insufficient when it goes to this type of strategic interactions. Imagine like you are facing a penalty kick. If you are a simple model-free RL agent, what it will predict is that if you kick the ball to the left and it scores, it will continue to do so, or you will increase your probability to do so, which is obviously a very stupid strategy. So how will agent learn during this process to score or to kick the ball to select the direction of the penalty kick? So this is what we call strategic learning, which, well, everyone knows is like really important, prevalent in social interactions and important cognitive functions, blah, blah, blah. So here, what we want to study, different from the traditional game theory, we're not aiming at developing what people should do, but rather we try to figure out what people actually did during this type of strategic learning process. So the game we used was a really simple one. Imagine you have $5 to spend and your opponent has $4 to spend. Both of you will decide at the same time how much money you will spend, and whoever spends more money will win a reward, which is $10. So you will probably say, well, this is so simple. Since I have $5, right? So I will always spend 5 and therefore I will always win. So what's the heck? And here the trick is that, well, you can spend from 0 to 5, by the way. So if you imagine if you always spend $5, this is a continuous process, and you and your opponent will play this game for 160 rounds. So if you always spend $5, your opponent will probably figure out that there's no way for him to win. And therefore, he'll probably spend only 0, so that he'll still keep $4 and go home with this $4, which is good enough, right? And over the time, if you find that your opponent will always spend $4, your optimal strategy will probably be spending $1 or $2 so that you can win at smaller cost. And once you switch to $1 or $2, your opponent will probably trying to spend $3 or $4 in order to win. And therefore, you'll go back to spending $5. As you can see, as this process goes on, you will actually trying to figure out or trying to predict what your opponent will do and trying to best respond to this. And that is the game, or that is the process that we are trying to understand. So at that time, this was a really old paper. So at that time, we used this traditional behavioral game theory paper, which basically proposed a hybrid human learning model, which nests not only the reinforcement, the simple model-free reinforcement learning, but also what is called a belief-based learning, which mathematically is actually equivalent to the model-based reinforcement learning that we saw in yesterday's tutorial under some mathematical constraints. So basically, let me give you an example. So basically, so this is how people actually play when this guy has altogether $4. You can see initially he will spend 0, and during the middle of the game, the probability of him spending 0 goes down, and the probability of him spending 2 or 4 probably goes up. And after a while, he go back to spend 0. Okay. And this is the reinforcement learning, which will predict that he'll play 0 all the way, because playing 0 will win him $4, which is good enough. That action will reinforce. And this is the so-called belief-based learning, which is you model how your opponent will do during this process and best response to it. And as you can see, there's a big sharp jump, decline in the probability of spending 0, which is quite different from what we see in the empirical. And the hybrid that combines both the reinforced learning and model-based learning or the belief-based learning actually fits the behavior pretty well. By the way, I'll just quickly mention, because yesterday I heard a lot of talks, a lot of mentioning about teaching in the strategic interaction processes. So I just want to bring to the attention that actually in the field of behavior economics, there was this old literature back in the early 2000s talking about strategic teaching and interactions during the strategic learning processes. Pretty well established. So maybe the different literature thinking about the same thing, but using slightly different language, which is always a good thing. Okay, so at that time, what we did is that we asked people to play the game that I just showed you, so that we can record their behaviors all the time. And then we record their neural signals, their fMRI signals, and then we use our model, the model that I just showed you. We can predict on a trial-by-trial basis what is his expectation about the reward associated with his choice. What is the expectation about he think that his opponent will do, and how surprised he is according to different learning models. And the hypothesis is that if some model is a right model, then we should see the corresponding neural correlates of that model prediction in the brain. Okay, so that's what we did. And what we find is that, well, just as I show you in the example, people have this both processes going on. For example, this is the model-free reinforcement learning. We saw this signal in the classic reinforcement learning areas encoding the prediction area. That is how surprised I am to the reward that I received. Moreover, we saw, no, this is the classic reinforcement learning signal. And moreover, we saw these belief-based or model-based signals not only in these classic striatal regions, as well as in the RACC, which is in our forehead, okay, a bit inside the forehead. And this actually codes the signal of how surprised you are about your opponent's choices. If you think he's going to play 0, but he played 4, you're really surprised, and we'll see a big jump of these signals. And the magnitude, like across people, if your brain is super sensitive to this signal, okay, in this area, we'll see behaviorally, you're more likely to use this belief-based signal relative to the model-free reinforcement learning signal. Okay, so that explains a little bit individual differences. Moreover, the question is, if we have this evidence that people do this 2 type of learning, then one possibility is that these 2 learning processes are serial, okay? Alternatively, they are parallel. Both are possible. For example, here, you first compute this signal, and then you pass your expectation to this one, and then do the computation, and then generate the final prediction, or this one. So behaviorally, it's very difficult to tell, to separate these 2 purely from the behavior, because they will generate predictions so close that there's no statistical power to tease them apart. But we can use the brain signal because it's high dimensional and a lot more sensitive. So what we did is that we can actually say, we can do this statistical comparison between the parallel prediction versus the serial prediction. And what we find is that, well, if we regress out all the serial prediction from the parallel prediction, we still see this brain signal remained. However, if we do the other way around, then we see no signals except in some visual areas. And this actually supports this parallel processing of both the model-free reinforcement learning and the belief-based or the model-based reinforcement learning in this strategic interaction. You'll probably ask, like, why it matters, right? Why we care whether the brain is doing this parallel serial computation? The reason is that it helps us to actually make some new predictions and to test them. For example, it suggests that, well, if this area of the brain is damaged, then we probably won't be able to do this belief-based learning that well, okay? And people found, now we found, people found this is indeed the case. This is some further evidence supporting the functioning of this area in strategic learning. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about this one where people find they train rodents to do hide and seek. Okay, if you look into this hole and computer look also into this hole, you are caught and you have no reward. Okay, just like how you play hide and seek. And then they can use drug and other methods to damage the neural activity in this ACC area and find that the strategic algorithm goes away in rodents' behavior, supporting the function. More importantly, we can also make a prediction about this area. So very interestingly, as I said, this striatal area is a classic region for reward-based learning in non-social situation. What we find is that this is also involved in strategic learning as well as this region in a parallel processing. So the prediction would be if this area is damaged, okay, then what you will find is that people will probably be damaged in simple reward learning in a non-social situation. But because their prefrontal areas are still good, so they can still do the strategic interaction. And that's what we found in the later lesion studies. So put it another way, if your striatal areas were damaged, actually a lot of patients, especially the elderly patients, shown this type of damage, then probably you will have a hard time in predicting like whether I should bring umbrella tomorrow doing this type of reward prediction. But if you think of the weather as someone as a strategic opponent trying to gaming against you, you'll probably be able to recruit this area and do pretty well. And that is what we see here. So in the strategic situation, the BG, which is this area with the damage, they are doing as good as the healthy control, but not in the non-strategic, which we will usually think the simpler situation. Okay, so that's that. Let me very quickly wrap it up. So we actually can show, using this brain technique to decompose the thinking or the social inferencing process during the previous super simple strategic interaction. So the next question is, well, a lot of studies about the dyadic interactions. What if we make the interaction a lot more complex? So probably I don't need to explain to this audience like how important social network is. So I just skip all those. And so back then, like 6, 7 years ago, we were thinking of doing this type of social learning on social networks. So the question for us is like how to figure out the simplest paradigm to do. Because if you're trying to study this, especially in combination with the brain, with the neural imaging technique, it's super, super complicated. So we need to find a really simple paradigm. So at that time, to us, the simplest paradigm would be the observational learning paradigm. So social animals can learn not only for the reward that they receive by themselves, but also by observing others. So if, for example, if I saw a monkey eat some fruit, then I'll be able to tell the food is not dangerous, it's okay to eat. And importantly, this type of behavior has been well established at computational and neural processes. For example, it can be captured by this observational learning algorithm where our brain forms this expectation about the underlying world for whether the food is dangerous or not. And this prediction is updated according to an action prediction error signal, which basically reflects how surprised you are when you saw someone else's action. If you think the food is dangerous, but the monkey eats it, then you are really surprised. You have this big action prediction error signal, which helps you to update your expectation. And this action predictions error signal has been robustly shown in the brain in this area in a quantitative way. So the higher the surprise, the larger this signal right above our ear in this area. Okay. So the problem here is that when we do observational learning in the traditional environment versus social networks, it will be quite different. For example, in the traditional situations, observational learning are classically studied in a centralized situation. That is, if I'm observing from multiple people, their signals are all IID. Therefore, all I need to do is just to combine their signals in a statistical as a statistical average, and that will give us the unbiased estimation about the underlying world. However, on social networks, things are different. For example, we are not only learning from other people, but also being learned by other people. So the information will flow back and forth. Moreover, the signals are correlated. For example, when I'm learning from A and B, both of them may be influenced by a common friend of theirs. Therefore, their signals may be correlated. And also, the amount of information contained in every signal by every node could be different. For example, this guy C, his neighborhood has less overlap with mine than comparing to A's neighborhood or B's neighborhood. Therefore, he may have more novel information or fresh gossip to share with me. So all this suggests that signals on social networks violates this traditional IID assumption. Therefore, to be an excellent, a perfect learner, you need to take into account the underlying network structure. But the question is how? So this is a really classic guessing game, probably a lot of people in this room know about. So this is how we study this. For example, there are two bags. One contains more yellow balls, one contains more blue balls, okay? The computer will randomly select a bag, and you will draw a ball from the selected bag and guess like which bag it is. So if it's your single decision, then if you draw a blue ball, you'll probably guess the bag contains more blue balls, which is correct. This is Bayesian, okay? No matter whether you know Bayesian or not, your instincts is right. If this is a centralized situation, everyone draws a ball with replacement from the same bag, and all they need to do is to aggregate their signal. So, okay, if all together there's more blue draws, then the bag contains more blue balls. That's simple. And finally, let's consider a distributed situation. That is, everyone draws a ball from the bag. They make their own independent guess, and then they can exchange their guess with their directly connected neighbors. In this way, their private information will flow along the network, and then they will repeat this process. So let's see exactly how we did this. So initially, people are placed on this 7-noded network. People will see this network structure and see their own location and will receive their own private draw. Okay, so the actual game looks like this. So they will actually see the location their node is, and they will receive their draw. Importantly, subjects knows that the probability of drawing either color of the ball is 207 or 5/7 IID distributed on the network. Okay. Importantly, everyone is doing the same thing. So this is a distributed learning. And everyone will make their independent guess based on their private signal. After that, people will see, okay, what their neighbor guessed in the first guess, okay? So, and I have to mention that this allows them to integrate the first-hand information from their neighbors, okay? And everyone is doing the same thing. As you can imagine, if someone, for example, player 2 has smaller number of neighbors, then the ability for him to aggregate this first-hand information is smaller because he has less observation, okay? And then after this, people will again observe what their neighbors, they will be able to revise their guess, very importantly. And then they will be able to observe their neighbors' revision one more time. So there's no private draw, only one private draw, and then they will see this revision. So during the time when you see your neighbor's revision, that will basically reveal the second-hand information your neighbor just received from his neighbor. And then they will revise one more time and then see the second revision and go on. So altogether, one game has this 3 stage where people will make an initial guess, observation, revision, observation, revision, observation, revision, all 3 stages. So altogether, there are 40 games on different networks. Each game has this random location, random underlying state, that is the bag, and random private signals. And subjects are incentivized to guess as accurately as possible of every single stages, okay? And there's no feedback on how accurate you or your neighbors guess during the experiments. So we recruit subjects, okay, and there are one is lying inside the FMI, whereas the 6 are sitting outside, connected by an intranet, and playing this game at the same time. And we create these 40 temporal virtual societies, okay, with different structures and different private signals. So the model is very, so there is this really famous model called degree learning model in the social learning literature, which is proposed by this statistician Degroote. Initially, it's a statistical model, basically suggests that it's so hard for people to do Bayesian learning on social networks, impossible in most of the network structures. Therefore, maybe people simply do a Markovian process where they are influenced by their neighbors or influenced by everyone on the network based on some fixed weight. Okay, so this will be a simple Markovian. But the problem is like, what is that influence weight? Because the weight is fixed. So what is that influence weight? So here we propose a adaptive version of Degroote. That is when we integrate first-hand information, because the first-hand information are reflecting what people just initially drew from the back. So those are IID. Therefore, they are simply doing an observational learning, nothing, no trick. However, when they're integrating second or third-hand information in S2 and S3, well, they will weight the prediction error signal according to how connected their neighbors are relative to how connected they themselves are. This suggests that if my neighbor is well connected, then I'll put smaller weight on how surprised I am about his signal, the action prediction error signal. And if I am more connected, then I will be less influenced or I will be less vulnerable to others' choices. So this basically suggests that this action prediction error signal will be the same throughout the learning processes. However, this RD, the relative degree signal, will be only showing up in S2 and S3, but not necessarily in S1. Let me give you an example. So here, the computer will randomly draw this bag containing more blue balls, and these are the private signals. And as you can see, when people are all doing perfect Bayesian, they'll be able to learn the underlying state, which is the bool. However, when people are doing Degroote learning, well, they will be biased towards misinformation because the guy in the center who has the most highest degree happen to have the wrong signal, and therefore his influence will bias the whole consensus. And in our data, we actually find that the data is quite similar to Degroote learning. And this actually provides a potential possibility for why there is this misinformation propagation on social network if people are doing Degroote learning. So we can fit a model, and basically the Degroote explains the data well in most of the subjects. And here are some results. For example, when we are looking at, oops, sorry. Oh, okay. I didn't show the first, yeah, here. So this is the first part. This is the sum of observations. That is whether or not you'll be biased about what people are doing. And we find that this influence is consistent across all 3 stages. However, if we accounted for this degree or neighbor's degree weighted sum of observation after regressing out the influence of the first part, then we find this influence only in S2 and S3, but not in S1. And similarly, if we look for like whether or not your susceptibility to a neighbor's degree weighted observation is modulated by your own connection, we find that, yeah, indeed, people with smaller degree, the OD self-degree, is more susceptible in S2 and S3, but not in S1. I will be very quick on the neural results. Basically, you'll find the consistent results in the neural part. So this is action prediction error signal, how surprised I am about neighbors. And we find this signal in the classic region encoding these action prediction errors throughout S1, S2, and S3. However, only S2 and S3, we'll find this area which is called DACC, that reflects how that is sensitive to this relative degree signal, okay, which it basically suggests that at every single time when I'm receiving a signal from my neighbor, my brain, this part reflecting how well connected he is relative to me, okay, and this signal is not shown in S1. Moreover, if we decompose this signal, we'll find that signal in this area is positively correlated with my neighbor's degree and negatively correlated with my own degree, supporting our hypothesis. Okay, so by the way, in the classic reinforcement learning, this area is shown to modulate the reinforcement learning rate. So this results basically is quite consistent with previous results. And we can also search in the whole brain to look for this degree signal during S1, and we don't find it. This basically suggests that people have this controlled process, okay? They are intentionally be able to encode or to use or not use neighbors' network structure property to guide their choices, okay? And finally, again, if you see this network structure signal in the brain, it does not necessarily mean that people use this signal to guide their choices. But what we find is that indeed across people, when you have this stronger signal in this area, your learning rate is more modulated by this RD signal, demonstrating this connection between behavior and the brain signal. Okay, let me quickly sum up this part. So we have more results, but basically what we propose that we can use this reinforced TD plus DGRU type of hybrid to decompose this learning signal or learning process on social networks into a couple of components. And we can actually find each component indeed works during the decision-making process in different brain regions, supporting this simplified algorithm. This basically suggests that people are not, I have more results I didn't show here, but believe me, people are not able to do Bayesian on this type of complicated networks because it requires you to take into account the full structure and really consider and really use that structure to filter out redundant information and only integrate the information necessary. And this basically suggests that the traditional RL can still work, okay, in this complex situation, but with some tweak. And this RD also suggests that how much influence I have or how vulnerable I will be to social influence on the network may be modulated by the network structure. Okay, and we have like a larger networks, and the results are actually this consistent, which I'll skip. Okay, I'll skip the other parts. So far, I have convinced you, that, hopefully, that we can start from the simple model free and then extend it to consider strategic situation using belief-based or model-based RL. And we can also extend this framework to study more complex social interactions on the network. The next question is, well, all of these are related about like how people form inferences during learning processes from their direct experience. They learn through this statistical learning. But the problem is that a lot of time we're facing a novel situation, a situation that we have never ever seen before. And how can we make inference in that situation? Well, in psychology, this is not a new question. For example, this type of stories are usually told and to evaluate whether a kid or a patient will have this theory of mind ability. And also there are some neural results suggesting that even in the DACs, even single neurons are able to code like what this guy knows versus what actually, where the bottle actually is. However, most of these lines of research doesn't really tell us about the underlying algorithm. Like what is the input of this TD process? What is the output, reinforcement theory of mind process? What is the output and what is the transformation? So this is why we want to study this. Okay, let me give you an example. Probably a lot of people know this example, but just for the sake of the other students. So imagine you go to this pretty big square and you get lost with your friends and you want to contact your friend, like to meet him somewhere, okay? However, your phone died, so you cannot call your friend. Where will you go to meet the friend? So many people who are familiar with the coordination game will probably be able to guess, okay, we'll go to this, I'll meet my friend online in this tower, okay? This is a novel situation. You've never been to this place before, never discussed this situation with your friend before, but how would you know, okay, so easily that this tower will be the right answer? And if you test this on naive individuals, more than 90% of them will select the tower. Therefore, the probability of you meet your friend there is indeed really high. So this is called coordination, which is basically people choose complementary actions in order to receive common goals, achieve common goals. And it's something widely found across social lives, like selecting dishes, complementary dishes for a potluck party, for example. This is my favorite example. And even in rodents, so this is my friend's experiments, they're able to train these rats to press the level at the same time so that they can receive reward. And these three rats are really able to coordinate on the timing of their decisions very well. However, if you think of this problem, it's quite challenging. So in one way, the traditional game theory will predict that this will involve a lot of high-level theory of mind. Basically, you need to infer where your friend will go, and then you think where your friend thinks that you will go, so on and so forth. On the other hand, this type of complex process is inconsistent with the fast and seemingly effortless process that you will be able to come up with the answer, like the tower, the blue tower. So it is suggested that people have this sort of tacit agreement in order to achieve coordination. And this is what people called, in Chinese, I'm not sure whether this is the same word in Japanese, but this is called tacit agreement. Okay, anyway, so if you're familiar with game theory, you probably already know the answer. So there is this famous proposal about focal point and common knowledge. Basically suggests that people will have this common knowledge about like what tends to stand out in the decision-making context, and therefore to use that as archer to align your beliefs and expectations. So for example, when you are writing an email to someone, and if you CC it to a number of people, then this email is common knowledge because everyone knows everyone received this email. However, if you BCC this email to some people, then in terms of information transmission is the same. Those people also receive the message, but they don't know other people receive it. So there's no common knowledge in the BCC situation. And also this sort of common knowledge will change our behavior. In a famous story, The Emperor's New Clothes, when the little kid says, well, the emperor wears no clothes, his announcement creates this common knowledge so that people will protest. And in our example, the recognition of this famous landmark or the landmark in the area is actually probably is the way to support the focal point and common knowledge. So the question is how to characterize focal point or common knowledge. There has been a lot of research in these areas over the past, 50 years or so. But as you can tell, it's quite complicated because the focal point or the common knowledge actually involves tons of stuff. It involves our perception, our emotion, our memory, and a culturally grounded knowledge. So usually people and famously, mathematical rational agent, a type of modeling cannot really solve this. And when people do these experiments in behavioral game theory, for example, they will systematically manipulate the stimuli. For example, they will show like four small square and then one large square and ask people to select. This large square is perceptually distinct, therefore that is the common knowledge for the focal point. But this type of experimental manipulation always pre-assume certain features that will contribute to this focal point or the common knowledge, which is probably not good enough. So in this research, we actually didn't try to characterize common knowledge, but rather we turn this question around and ask, hey, if indeed this common knowledge supports coordination, then what should we see in people's brain? What is the neural signature? And our hypothesis is the following. So if people really have the common knowledge, then they will have these aligned knowledge representations when they see the object, when they see the stimuli, and that will facilitate their coordination. Okay, so in the neuroscience literature, there has been tons of studies about the neural alignment, suggesting that when animals are interacting with one another, there are these correlated, either temporally or spatially correlated brain signals underlying these social interactions in rodents, in mice, in monkeys, in humans as well. However, this line of research has two shortcomings. One is that a lot of these signals are correlational. So you cannot really tell the extent to which this neural alignment indeed supports social interaction, or they just reflect some shared experiences. Moreover, there's no theory or no model suggests like how cognitive operations supported by neural alignment indeed guide our coordination. So this is how we study this. So we create this cross-task, cross-sample prediction of coordination. In the first study, we recruit 34 subjects to passively looking at a sequence of images. Okay, these are all landscape images from around the world. They are pretty diverse. And then in the second experiment, which is online, including a separate more than 300 subjects, and they are playing a pure coordination game. That is, these 200 images in study one were randomly grouped into a group of 4 and presented to the online subjects. And their goal is to select one image in order to match with the image selected by other subjects online, okay? So our hypothesis is that, well, first of all, if we can measure the neural response when people are looking at these images and measure the degree to which their brain signal align or correlated to one another during this passive viewing, and then use that to predict the coordination behavior or the probability of selecting a picture during this coordination. The reason is the following. First of all, if the brain signal, if there indeed is common knowledge, then we should be able to measure that independent of decision-making process. And secondarily, if this common knowledge is indeed widely shared across population, then we should be able to measure this in one group of people and then use that to predict behavior in a separate group of people. So this is the game. For example, this is the example. And there are two conditions, as you can imagine. One is coordination condition, where you can choose the same picture as others, and others also aim to choose the same as you. Whereas the second condition is the solo condition, where simply ask people to choose a picture. As you can see, so here is the example. This is the choices for this example trial. Because the pictures are randomly grouped, so the coordination is not like super good, but still it's higher than the chance level. Whereas in the individual condition, when people are making exactly the same choice within, when people make the same choice within the same set of pictures, they are not that different from chance level. Okay. And then I'll skip this part. Basically, what we did is that we can measure like how aligned the brain signals are when people are looking at each individual pictures, and then use that to predict for every trial and every picture, like how likely people will select one picture, okay? And then we can use this to predict, to generate predictions about like people's choices in the brain and compare that with the actual choices. So we can find a set of brain regions, which I'm going to skip, but I'll give you an example. So this is the example that I showed you, and you can see the alignment in this region, the red, which is the posterior cingulate cortex, really aligned very well with how likely people are choose this in the coordination. Interestingly, this picture is the most popular in the solo condition, which actually has the least amount of alignment. And we can also simply visualize the brain activation in this region across people. And you can simply tell by eyeballing that this image associated with more similar brain activation across people relative to this one. Okay, and what we can do is we can even do some manipulation. For example, we can use this region to calculate a neural alignment for all the 200 pictures. And then we can pick the top 10 pictures has the highest alignment and 30 pictures has the lowest alignment. Then we can randomly group the one with high alignment with 3 with low alignment and generate novel pairs. This will give us sharp prediction, right? People will be very likely to choose the picture with high alignment if this neural alignment indeed reflects common knowledge that support coordination. And we create more than 6,000 new trials and give them to another 200 subjects. And this is what we found. That is when the images, the new questions are created based on the alignment in this red region, we indeed see the predictive power. So people are more likely to select these high alignment images in coordination, but not in the solo condition. But when the new questions are created according to the alignment in control region, which is implicated in semantic processing or visual processing, we see no predictive power. Okay, one final thing, 2 minutes and now I'm done. Then the core question we're interested in is how people actually make decisions during that pure coordination process. So we can build a computational model to it. The model basically is a strategy arbitration model. It suggests that it assumes that there are 2 possible strategies underlying the coordination process. One is the intuition-based or the knowledge-based strategy, in which basically we predict that people will select the image that's most likely to be recognized as the focal point or with the highest amount of common knowledge. The other strategy is the reasoning-based strategy formalized according to the cognitive hierarchy theory. Basically, it assumes that people have different levels of sophistication. And the level 0, which is the most naive player, will simply play according to the solo condition. And the level 1 will best respond to level 0, level 2 will best respond to level 0, and level 1, so on. And the population follows this Poisson distribution. Okay, so the core assumption is that when you see a trial, you're trying to arbitrate between these 2 processes according to whether or not this trial contains sufficient amount of common knowledge. And in order to tell this, we use this brain alignment as this a proxy for the common knowledge. So if at least one picture is associated with this brain alignment higher than unknown parameter theta, then it will use this knowledge-based strategy. Otherwise, it will use the reasoning-based strategy. We are able to do this cross-validation. So we can first estimate the free parameter in half of the trials and be able to classify our trials into 2 categories. One relies more on this knowledge, on the common knowledge. One relies more on social reasoning. And then we can test this prediction in the second half of the data and see indeed that the one that we predict will rely more on common knowledge indeed was predicted better by the alignment-based strategy, whereas the other half will predicted better by the reasoning-based strategy. Although our model didn't use any reaction time data or make any assumptions about reaction time, it actually has a pretty strong temporal assumption. That is, chances are these 2 strategies will act one like a fast, intuitive strategy, and the other act as a more deliberative or effortful, slow strategy. Therefore, we can again use our out-of-sample separation of 2 types of trials and to compare how fast people will decide in these 2 types of trials. Indeed, we find that trials that classified as will rely more on intuition or on common knowledge are associated with faster decision time. They are about 0.51 seconds faster than the second half than the reasoning-based strategy, okay? Suggesting that this intuition of common knowledge of focal point probably indeed provide a computational shortcut to the coordination decision process. Okay, let me finish up. So basically, we start with this necessary condition of this common knowledge hypothesis, and we find this brain region will reliably and specifically predict coordination. So it raises a lot of questions about the underlying process that hopefully we'll be able to address in the future, as well as how can we align this knowledge representation between human and other intelligent systems. So one more comment to the tutorial yesterday. So we talked a lot about hierarchical reasoning, theory of mind. One possibility that was missed from yesterday's tutorial is the following. So we not only we can think about or infer what other people do, we can also think as we and act as together as we and think of, for example, in the coordination situation. So that suggests that beyond theory of mind, there's also another possibility of theory of minds, which may, in some situation, as I said, is more heuristic, more efficient, and support flexible, scalable social cooperation. Okay, so with that, I thank my lovely lab at Peking University, as well as Yao Ming, who is the first author of the network study, and Wang Cong, she is the first author of the coordination study. Okay, thank you.